Hello, and good afternoon to all of you. I had a message the other day from an old friend of mine who dropped me a line, is battling cancer this year and has been battling it since really the early months of calendar year 2014 and is expected to continue battling cancer into next year. And the message from this individual, somebody I care about very, very much and have a long, long history with, was that it wasn't going to be a very good Christmas at her house. And that's because she doesn't have the money, all of it going into treatment, to afford gifts for children and grandchildren. And the thought struck me that maybe perhaps it's time to consider what things are really all about this time of year, especially when it comes to family and those people that we happen to love. And I shared with her a story that was passed down in my family from my mother and was also corroborated by my uncles, all three of them on her side of the family, when all four were still alive. Oddly enough, there is just one left of that group of children, and he was the oldest among them. He's the last to bear witness to these stories from another age. I'm just passing them along secondhand. During the Great Depression, my mother's family had lived on a farm in upstate New York, actually a far corner of western New York State, just outside a little hamlet called Black Creek, where probably there had never been any more than 200 people who've lived there. And still to this day, the population can't be any higher than 150 to 200. There's no industry. It's mainly just in support of the dairy industry in the area, or people have to travel long, long distances to find work elsewhere. There are no wealthy people in Black Creek, New York. It just simply doesn't exist. Everyone is pretty much on the same plane. They're working for a living, and they're trying to survive. It's no different, really, than it was back during the days of the Depression. My grandfather, on my mother's side of the family, was an electrician, back in the day when really many people weren't working in that occupation. Still, during the Depression, there wasn't much work, so he ended up working on the farm with his father, my great-grandfather. Eventually, they were able to buy a house in town, that is, in the hamlet of Black Creek, in fact, just across from the two-room schoolhouse where one of my mother's uncles happened to be teaching. Then World War II came along. World War II is really the demarcation between what you'd call the lack of things people had, the deprivations, is that the word, that they had during the Depression, and suddenly everyone had work after the war broke out. And my uncle, or rather my grandfather, managed to get a job working in a factory in Buffalo. Buffalo, as the crow flies, maybe 50 miles from Black Creek, New York, but on winding roads, especially before interstates, likely that trip was often closer to 75 or 80 miles to get to work. He was commuting this trip back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, in an automobile from an era when you probably didn't have a lot of grip on the road, and in snowy weather, as we've witnessed recently, they get a lot of that in that part of the country. In snowy weather, it must have added even more time to his commute. So his commute some days must have been several hours just one way. Christmas was approaching, early in World War II, and the family was still trying to dig out from its difficulties during the Great Depression. There wasn't a lot of money to go around, and Grandpa was working far away, as I've mentioned, and still trying to get some sleep in between. He decided one day to go for a walk, though, when he got home, to clear his head, and he was concerned and he was worried about what type of holiday his children were going to have. He now had 4 little ones at home. While he was out for a walk, he ran into a neighbor who was throwing away 4 runner sleds. These were all beaten up, the wooden slats were broken in many places, and the metal, the runners especially, these were all rusted. And the sleds, for the most part, were lacking any ropes for steering. And he ended up saying to the neighbor, "Can I have those?" And the neighbor said, "Well, I'm throwing them out. You do whatever you want with them." And my grandfather, he took them home. He took them into his garage, where he would then spend late hours into the evenings. And this is along with his commute, which is sometimes several hours a day. He would go into the garage after dinner. No one knew what he was up to. But he rebuilt all of those broken wooden slats. And then he put a new finish on all of that wood. Sanded down some of the hard, rough edges, too. He sanded down the metal until it was nice and smooth and clear again. And then he painted it a bright red, to the point where, and then after putting ropes through the steering mechanism, any of you who've ever been on one of those sleds, steering might be a bit of an oxymoron, but still you had some leverage and pull with the ropes that were at the front of the sled. But he rebuilt these till they looked almost brand new, if not brand new. Christmas morning arrived, and as every year, my mother and her brothers went to the tree, and they would find that they would have something along the lines of an orange. You have to remember, it was only in the last 50 to 60 years that some of these exotic fruits became commonplace across the country. Getting an orange at Christmas was a really, really big deal. And then they found 4 runner sleds under the tree. Now, they spent the rest of the day outside in the snow, sledding in the snow. And I'm only going to tell you this story I'm telling you this story, I think it says something about how love goes into the gifts that we give people. And it's not just about going down to your local Walmart or your Target or your Kmart and buying thousands of dollars worth of toys and then wrapping these up and stuffing them under a tree in the hopes that you might buy some sort of love or fealty from your children. Fealty is a common word in a lot of my videos lately, and it basically means loyalty. Sometimes, though, it is purchased. I remember this story because my mother told me the details of it when I guess I was a young teenager. And I asked my grandmother, my grandfather had long since passed away, I asked my grandmother, she backed it up, she verified it, and also my uncles later on did it frequently when I would bring up the story. I think it speaks volumes, though, about where we are today, and the concerns of my friend suffering from an illness that could eventually be deadly are pretty much put into perspective now at this point about what family life is really all about. Just a few thoughts today I wanted to share after returning from my weekly trip to church. I hope you are well, and I hope you keep in mind during this holiday season that there are things that are far more precious than any shiny baubles.